Everybody, we are about to finish off China. We have made our way up to the Republic of China, the end of the last dynasty, the end of the Qing dynasty. And we kind of finished last time talking about the chaos of China in the modern era, all of these things happening in the 19th century, leading up to 1912 with the revolution that established the Republic of China, and really it's attempts to westernize in many ways. That connection to the West was a big part of it. Let me start this and move on. We're just going to look at a few words from this last period. I don't want to spend much time on it. But from the Republic of China during this period, this is a period, of course, under Chiang Kai-shek, where the connections to the West were the greatest. And when you look at a painting like this, it's painfully obvious what this artist is looking at. He's looking at Western European art of the early 20th century. And I shouldn't say he, because this is a woman artist, Guan Zilan. It's Portrait of Miss L. It's #1 in oil on canvas, which is certainly not a Chinese painting format. Everything about it is Western. The idea of portraiture is Western. And as I mentioned last time, again, whenever Western art started creeping in, it was always sort of seen as exotic in China. So this has an exotic quality to it, a modern quality. This is sometimes referred to as Republican era modernity, which is basically European. She was from Shanghai. Shanghai, even now, actually, but then was very much an arts center. It was an international city. In the 20s and 30s, it was sort of the place to be. She had studied in Japan. A lot of Chinese artists studied in Japan. Japan at this time was seen as a model for Westernization. It was the most Westernized country in Asia. Many Japanese artists had studied in Europe. And so to go to Japan and study with a Japanese artist who had studied in Paris, as her teacher had, is where this all comes from. And in case you weren't with us in the Western class, I'll remind you of something like a painting by Matisse. Now, this is much earlier. In 1929, that really wasn't the European style anymore. That's more the European style before World War I. So she's picking up on an older style, but that's probably when her teacher was in Paris studying. So it's, a direct connection. It's pretty obvious. It's also pretty obvious that this style really completely abandons an Eastern tradition. This is not a merging of Chinese style with Western. This is purely a Western style. And there is a slightly later sort of, I don't want to call it a backlash, but there was a movement called the New Cultural Movement, which still during the Republic of China, but much later, which sought to more merge the styles rather than abandon. In other words, save what's left of Chinese traditional style and merge it with the West. And this artist, Xu Baihong, also studied in Japan earlier, much earlier, quite a few years earlier, before this style began. And he was actually a very well-known, internationally known artist, a very important artist. This particular painting is important. First of all, Foolish Old Man Removes the Mountain. I'll tell you what that story is in a minute, because the story is an important one. It's good size, right? 4'9" high, 13, almost 14 foot long. This is sort of mural size, but it's an exaggerated horizontality in relation to Western murals. And some people have seen this in connection to sort of like a hand scroll. It has some of the characteristics of a hand scroll in its long horizontality. Now, you might recognize from the figures that not everyone in this painting is Chinese. He was actually in India when he painted this. What I hadn't known before I studied this period is the close connection between China and India during this period, particularly because since 1931, China's been at war with Japan during this period. Since 1931, they've been fighting. And this artist was part of a diplomatic mission in India, attempting to raise support for the resistance to Japanese invasion, because the Japanese at this point had the intention of conquering all of Asia. And so involving all of Asia, and that was part of it. There were also in China during this period a great many Indians working. So he's in India when he's painting it, but he's painting a scene of something happening in China with Indian workers in the painting. So it's really speaking about what's happening in a particular moment in time, but also engaging a kind of almost a pan-Asian concept here of sort of togetherness. Now, the story is an interesting one. It's a traditional Chinese story about an old man who, from where he lived, there was a whole chain of mountains that was blocking his view, and he wanted them removed. So he decided to go out and remove the mountains. So he just starts digging on one of these mountains, and everybody's laughing at him and, telling him, you're never going to remove this mountain. And basically he says, well, I might not finish, but, with perseverance, my children will keep working and their children will keep working, and eventually we will remove this mountain. And the gods were so impressed by his actions, what he's trying to do, and how he framed that they ordered the mountains immediately to separate so that he would have his view. So obviously it's a story of perseverance. Well, see, there's many ways you can interpret this story. That's kind of the point. His immediate intention is that it's about perseverance and it's about family and everyone working together. It was sort of at that point. Now, after 1949, with the Communist Revolution and when Mao takes power, this painting was still being heralded as a very important painting, but it was reinterpreted. And it's pretty easy to see how it can be reinterpreted in a context primarily relating to collectivism and a communist sense of everyone working together. So rather than sort of long-term perseverance, it becomes about a kind of communist collectivist thinking. So a very interesting, it's really a beautiful painting. It's very interesting. It's very Western in so many ways in terms of its detail. It's sort of, there's a realistic detail here and a modeling of three-dimensional form that isn't typical in China. We saw a bit of it coming in the last dynasty, where you would have some shadows on figures, etc. But this is modeled, quite thoroughly in depth. Clearly by this time, they no longer thought that shading made someone look dirty. If you weren't with us last time, it's one of the reasons the Chinese rejected putting shading on figures, is they thought it made people look dirty, like you had a dark smudge on your face. But clearly they're used to it now. It's another one of those cases where, over time you learn how to read something. You learn how to see, and they've learned how to read that not as a dirty smudge, but as a shadow. Also, the sort of nudity, some people have suggested there's a kind of heroic quality to the nudity, which is a Western, a very Western conception overall. So there are many ways that this has changed. I also like, there seems to be a Chinese family here. We have a Chinese woman, child, and an older man. So are these figures sort of working, are these men working sort of on their farm or at their business? That's sort of the implication, because we know these are meant to be Indian workers, but it's a sort of a Chinese setting in which they're working. Now, once Mao takes power, all sorts of things change, and what we begin to see under Mao from 49 up until his death in the 70s is a style called socialist realism. If you were with us again with the Western course, when we got to the 20th century, we talked about a style called social realism. Social realism and socialist realism are the same thing. It just depends where you're located. If you are in Russia or China, we call it socialist realism. If you are in Germany or the United States, we call it social realism. But it's exactly the same thing. It's using realism for propagandistic purposes, generally constructing a world that doesn't exist and never did exist, that suggests all is well, everyone is happy, and that those in power are beloved of the masses. So socialist realism is very prominent, particularly it begins in the 30s. You see it in Nazi Germany in the 30s. You see it in the United States under the WPA project. The 30s was in the West a decade of great conservatism in art. It's a backlash against the 20s. It's a period that's particularly interesting to me because it's my specialty. But yeah, it's intriguing, that relationship between the 20s and the 30s and then that sort of snapback. The only difference between American art and the rest of this is that social realism was not a legally mandated style in this country. It was in Nazi Germany, in Russia, and in China under Stalin. However, if you wanted a job under the WPA as an artist, you better work in this style. So it may not have technically been legally mandated, but if you wanted to eat, you'd better work in this style during the Depression. So there were ways of controlling it. So you see it here. It's fairly obvious. You also see the design style, the color styles that are very, very similar to some Russian examples we looked at and some Nazi art we looked at. The style is almost identical. Does this look familiar again? We talked about this last time when we looked at the Imperial Palace, how everybody needed to go there and get their pictures taken. So now we have an oil painting. Now this is more subtle socialist realism. It's not sort of a poster screaming propaganda at you, but it's still the same thing. The family and what we can't recognize is by their clothing, we're recognizing people over here, in particular, this group coming a great distance from rural areas in China who have come to the imperial city. So it's people, and then we get the military reference over here. So there are subtle ways of getting these references. And of course, Chairman Mao, this is the Tiananmen Gate that we looked at last time, still getting their photographs. People are still getting their photographs taken there. But this big painting, 5'9", so there are Western aspects to this, oil and canvas and the like, but the underlying story is still going to be what it is. So this is early, this is People's Republic of China under Mao, but there is post-Mao People's Republic of China, which is basically where we are right now. And since Mao's death, artists have sort of walked a tricky road in China. Artists still don't know what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. It's basically constantly testing the waters. Many artists in China get in a lot of trouble for what they do, are imprisoned. Ai Weiwei is the most famous Chinese artist. He's constantly surveilled, followed. His studio's been destroyed. He's in prison a lot. And yet his art isn't nearly as political as many other artists who are not touched at all. And that's why it's tricky for artists. There are some artists, I don't understand it myself, who can do incredibly pointed political work and nobody says a thing to them. And other artists, go to prison for something, to my eye, which seems far less political and overt. And so they begin testing the waters and trying out social criticism. You seem to be able to make certain kinds of social criticism as long as you're not specifically speaking to those who are in political power at the moment. You're not taking the current leader and mocking him. And so this artist, Zhang Zhaogang, is very well known for a series of works that deal with the idea of the one-child family and the importance of that child. As you can see, 5 foot by 6.5 foot. This is really big painting, and whenever you get faces this big, it's a powerful scene. The red cord that wraps all around them and sort of ties them together, you could partially see it as maybe veins, blood veins or connecting family, but it's also a Chinese saying, and I can't even remember the details, I should have looked it up, that has to do with the red cord that binds people. Does anybody remember what that is? I can't remember how that's phrased. But anyway, let's just say it binds and connects them. He's also sort of, the coloring is important. It's like they're growing paler and paler. That's when I read these blood vessels. It's like they're being drained as the child becomes, more colorful and richer. And he's spoken a lot about this, so we know what he's thinking. But he talks about the how important that child is when you have one child, and how that's changed the family dynamic. Parents are so invested in that one child that it's become almost like an obsessive relationship. This is all you get, one chance, you've got to be successful. So, talk about sort of helicopter parents. I mean, this is sort of to the extreme. And then also he's quite literally exposing the genitalia, identifying this as a male child.
You're all saying that there are certain people, and maybe not a lot of white people.
What? I'm sorry? I'm missing that. I missed that.
Yeah, I don't know what that was.
I don't know what that was. Anyway, by identifying this as a male child, they all want male children. I mean, we all know that until fairly recently, it was not that uncommon. If you had a daughter, you took that daughter out into the woods and abandoned it, exposing children so that basically nobody would know you had it. So you basically then just keep going until you get a male child. I mean, that was one of China's big scandals throughout most of its history, was this, literally the murdering of female children until you got the male, because that was by far the most important. So he's really speaking to a lot of traditions and history in China, and not all of it's particularly beautiful. So he's questioning, and as far as I know, he hasn't had any problem, because he's looking at a social issue, not a political regime. So he's able to get away with that. Not everybody is, let me see, let me get back here. Not everybody is quite so kind. This artist, Yu Yuan, I don't know how he gets away with a lot of this. He's really speaking about the cult of Mao, and the cult of Mao today is very different from what it was when Mao was alive, because there's whole generations out there that never lived under Mao and really don't know anything about the man or what life was like then. And I can guarantee you they're not reading the truth. They're not learning the truth about what it was like then either. So that's what amazes me. Mao is still held. I met quite a few people who were telling me how great Mao was. These are young people who just idolize Mao as like almost a living god. And they credited him with the new freedoms that China has. They credited him with the great new economy. They gave him credit for things that he had nothing to do with, or in fact was the absolute opposite of what he did. But we just let him talk and didn't really contradict anybody. Wouldn't have done any good to do that. But Yu Yuan is connecting this Mao and this imagery, and I don't know how many of you recognize this relationship to the work of Andy Warhol, but that's completely what he's doing here. A pocket Western art history. Actually, Chinese artists and contemporary Japanese Japanese artists both deal with the relationship, particularly to America. They're fascinated with American culture and American culture's relationship to China or Japan, wherever they're living. In this particular one, you can see what he's done is merge two iconic images. He's dealing with sort of the cult of celebrity, the cult of Mao, the idea of iconic figures, and he's merged it with a very famous image by Andy Warhol of Marilyn Monroe. And that's exactly what it is. It's a total merging of those two images, which speaks of so many different things, particularly like cultish admiration. And Warhol was fascinated with celebrity and the idea of a mask, the idea of an outward appearance that really has nothing to do with the person, that it's just a sort of shield. And so he made this image of Marilyn that's basically, if you removed the color that is artificial makeup or dye, there's nothing there. There's literally no image there. It's all false image. And so he's sort of playing with this, with the Mao figure. Warhol himself actually did a series of Mao. I mean, these are all Andy Warhol. This is Warhol up above, where he used his sort of print transfer technique and these sort of flat color to do a series of Mao, because he was also fascinated with the idea of in Mao in the same way. Now in the hands of a Chinese artist, he's done two different things. He's taken the traditional sort of political image of Mao and merged it with the celebrity image. And so it makes you think about this sort of political cult of Mao. It's really interesting work that makes you think of, it's very simple, but it makes you think about a lot of complex relationships. And that's really what it's all about. Okay, let's talk about Southeast Asia. This is a good time to talk about it because chronologically, physically, a lot of ideas and peoples moved from China down into Southeast Asia. So we'll do this before we move on to Japan. So we're talking, of course, down here. It's not all on this map. We don't actually have Indonesia on this map. They left it off, but we'll see it here. Here's a better map. We're actually going, we're not back this up again. What is happening? Everything is moving all over. Here we go. We're not looking at every country. I want to look at Thailand, Indonesia, and Cambodia. So we're not going to do Burma. We're not going to look at anything from Laos or Vietnam. We're just going to focus on these three places because they're very important. Now, this part of the world becomes extremely important. It's right in the center of what's called the China Passage, or the shipping routes from India and the Middle East around and into China. And that's where, ideas are coming from. Everything's coming from that direction. So it becomes very, very important, and ideas merge in really interesting ways. So Thailand is very strangely shaped country. Right here is where we're going to start. And Thailand, the culture is centered around the rivers. There are several rivers here that come together right around here and form the Chao Phraya River, which flows from here on south. And as we're going to see, there are northern cultures and southern cultures. And they're really quite different. The north is very mountainous. It's a very mountainous region, and it's very different kind of people living there. While in the south, it's a basin, it's a rice growing area, and really quite different. When India is expanding its trade routes, Thailand becomes very important. As early as very early on, by the 1st century CE, Mahayana Buddhism is reaching Thailand very, very early. But in the 7th century, Theravada monks from Sri Lanka enter the region and bring Theravada Buddhism. And we'll talk more about that actually, we'll talk about it now. This was Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka became in India the center for Theravada Buddhism, which is that earlier monastic, and it still is. It is the center, the world's center for Theravada Buddhism. So when these monks come into Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand, their impact is really quite profound, to the point that Mahayana Buddhism kind of disappeared. It's really a Theravada nation, and it's the only one. It's the only place in Southeast Asia where this monastic practice really took hold, to the point that, and I believe it's still true today, it was, I know, 20, 30 years ago, every young man was required to spend, I don't know, a year, I can't remember how long, in a monastery. It was like your military service. You had your monk service, and then you left. It wasn't permanent. So everybody goes, all young men anyway, go through that monastic tradition. And that's going to shape the art quite profoundly, because what we learned in India is that under Theravada Buddhism, there is a minimal set of forms. You know, it doesn't have all these hundreds of deities and hundreds of figures and forms. It's very minimal. And Thai art is very minimal in terms of the forms that it has. And once a form is sort of established, it becomes tradition, and it doesn't change much. So that's going to affect the art, and that's going to be quite different from what we see before. Now, one of the very earliest kingdom or rulers that we have are Dvaravati culture. Dvaravati was really the name of a dynasty of rulers. It wasn't an ethnicity. The ethnicity that dominated, and this is in sort of southern part of Thailand, were the Mon people. And the Mon people are an ethnic minority in Thailand and Southeast Asia now. They were the majority of people at this time, 6th to the 12th century, the Mon. And the Mon are going to be pushed further south, and they're going to become a sort of disenfranchised monastery minority a little later, but not yet. So this was the Dvaravati kingdom, of Dvaravati culture is the name given to this culture of the Mon people in southern Thailand and also in southern Burma. Art is really rare from this period. Most of it has disappeared, but we do have a figure here that is fairly typical of this early Thai art. It's the head of a Buddha figure, strong Indian influence, as you could imagine. It's brought by Indian monks. Some stylistic characteristics, the sort of snail curl hair that we saw in India, this sort of bow-shaped eyebrows. It's sort of a single form that moves across. These almond-shaped eyes. They're sometimes referred to as everted. See this little lid that's sort of almost like a lip over the eye here to create this, and also the lips. It's called an everted lip. Everted mean the opposite of inverted. So the inverted is turned in, everted means turned out. So the lip is sort of turned out so that you get this little edge to it. That's a sign of a Thai art. It's also, incised with detail. You also see, although this is quite early, the Ushnisha is beginning to become elongated. This is one of the principal characteristics of all Southeast Asian art. Now, the Dvaravati kingdom lost power, lost its leadership and support of the Mon Confederate by the 11th century. And what happened is the southern part of Thailand fell to the Khmer. And we're going to talk more about the Khmer when we get to Cambodia. But the Khmer were powerful rulers, a dynasty centered in Cambodia. But during this period, they are controlling much of Southeast Asia. They control Thailand, a little bit of Burma, Laos. I mean, the Khmer were very powerful. And so during this period, there's really no difference between Thai art and Cambodian art. It's all Khmer art. It's all identical. And it's quite different from some of the earlier style. This is a Buddha Mukhalinda. Mukhalinda is one of the Nagas. Remember, we've talked about the Nagas before. The Naga kings, they are these associated with these snake-like creatures. We saw it mostly in the context of Hindu art. We saw Vishnu reclining on one of the Nagas. It was a snake-like form with this sort of hoods that came up. In Buddhism, the Nagas are embraced, particularly Mukhalinda Buddha, who is said to be the Naga that shielded Shakyamuni Buddha from the rain while he was meditating. So the form we see in Buddhist imagery is this, of a meditating Shakyamuni and this cobra-like form coming up with the 7 cobra heads protecting him. Now his face is gold leafed here, interestingly. Unlike the Hindu version, where, well, we've seen some versions where the figure turns into the snake. This is really him sitting on the coiled body of the snake. So this is Shakyamuni, but sitting on the coiled body. What we've got here is much softer forms, softer features. In fact, they're beginning to be sort of boneless. That's going to become a characteristic of later Thai art. We notice the Ushnisha is now more elongated. If ever you see a Buddha or a Bodhisattva with this very long, elongated Ushnisha, that is from Southeast Asia. They're all going to be like that, and you'll never see it in China, India, or Japan. So it's a characteristic that we'll always identify, somewhere in Southeast Asia. Now, while the Khmer are ruling in the South, changes are happening in the North. The North began to have an influx of people from China. 13th century, we are talking about the Mongol invasion of China, what will become the Yuan dynasty, but it was pushing Chinese people south. And there was an influx of Chinese into Burma, Thailand, and Laos, and they were coming over the mountains and entering into the north, and they are known as the Thai people, and they are ethnically very different from the Mon people in the South. And they're basically immigrants who've been forced south, some into Vietnam as well. And by 1238, they start moving south and displacing and forcing out the Khmer, because the Khmer were already weakened by that point. The Mon people, who were unfortunately linked to the Khmer, they really weren't, I mean, they'd been conquered by them, but they weren't really affiliated with them. But the Thai people now became the majority, and the Mon became a kind of repressed ethnic minority, which is what they are today. And now we're into what we really call Thai art. And there are 3 periods. We're not going to look at them all, but they center one. The first period is known as the Sukhothai or Sukhodai, sometimes written with a T, sometimes with a D, that centers around this basin here where the 3 rivers come together. There's a later Ayutthaya period, and then Bangkok is down here. But mainly we're talking about Sukhothai or Sukhodaya. This was an important center in Sukhodaya because it was sort of between the northern region and the southern region. It was an important trading center between the north and the south. It also was a kind of, Thailand formed what was sort of a version of a free trade zone. People could trade through Thailand. It made it very important in that part of the world. Now, when the Khmer were here, as I said, we'll talk about the Khmer more in a moment. The Khmer are known as great engineers, particularly great hydraulic engineers. And they had done incredible work in southern Thailand, building things, dams and waterworks and all sorts of things. And when the Thai moved down, they tore it all down. They got rid of everything because it was Khmer, but it's really too bad because they had done some beautiful work where they just destroyed everything. Now, once the Thai took over, there were 9 consecutive kings over a 200-year period, and in the Sukhothai period, that's an average of about 23 years. That's a really stable regime when you have kings ruling for that long. The Thai kings took a sort of paternal role within the culture, and they're the ones actually that made it a free trade zone and opened up trade. They opened up, it was a center for religions as well. A lot of things were happening in this part of the world during the Thai period. It really is a golden age for this nation. This is a very famous Sukhothai Buddha. You can recognize them. They're not like any other Buddha figures anywhere. It's very much a Thai style. Yes, we get the very tall Ujnisha, but there are other characteristics. He is seated. This is Shakyamuni Buddha. We know that because he's seated in he has particular mudras. This is the earth touching mudra, which we've encountered before. I remember where we saw it before. We saw it in India, the Kushan. One of the earliest images of a Buddha was in this position. This was meant to be the moment when, you know, he's being tempted and tormented by Mara to break his concentration, and he reaches and touches the earth and says, "No, I call upon the earth to witness that I will not be, you know, distracted from my goal." So that's what's happening here. In typical Southeast Asian style, he has little or no clothing. If he does, it is so attached to the body that it becomes invisible. I love his face. I mean, it's not like anything we've seen before. It's this totally peaceful, meditated, really kind of smiling face. The features actually have been taken from an Indian text that described the face of the Buddha. He is said to have had an egg-shaped head, which kind of we all do. That's not particularly unusual, but a scorpion sting. His Ushnisha is described as a scorpion sting tail. So this is meant to reference a kind of scorpion tail, but it's also meant to reference a flame. So it looks like a flame, but also a scorpion tail. It said he had a parrot nose, or a parrot-like nose, like a beak. So he's got this very wide, almost beak-like nose, a drawn bow eyebrow. So we saw that earlier. So it's like the curve of a bow. He's described as having a chin like a mango stone. So the chin is like a big round stone, and eyes like lotus buds. And I truthfully don't know what that means. So I'm not quite sure how those eyes are like lotus buds, and skin as smooth as a banyan tree. So the whole thing is very Sukhothai Buddha style in that it's all like one single piece. There are no planes, there are no breaks. It's very fluid, boneless. It's really just the essence of almost of meditation. It's like a liquid as a metaphor for a state of enlightenment. I really do love his eyes, and I love that little smile, that sort of beautiful little smile. It's very approachable. It's very graceful, very meditative and calm. It's a very beneficent figure. It's the least off-putting of any Buddha figure we have seen so far in this class, or will see. I don't think there's any other that's quite as approachable as this sort of figure. It's often said that the true Sukhothai figures have an inner life to them, that you can recognize them immediately because of an inner life. And as vague as that may be, I swear I see it here. This is an this is an inner life that this figure has. It feels like it's going to stand up and walk away. There's something in it, and it's very hard to describe what that is. Another unique form that develops in the Sukhothai is a walking Buddha. Now, there's nobody else does a walking Buddha. We've seen standing Buddhas early on. Mostly we've seen seated Buddhas. That's the most common, but walking is unique. Now, I don't know why, because, he walked and he was known to have walked all over India. Theravada Buddhists reference that walking that he did with footprints, the early, before there were images of Buddha, where he was only symbolized in India, one of the things that symbolized him were footprints. So that's a kind of reference to the walking Buddha. And now these are Theravada monks, remember? These are being made for Theravada institutions. So this is sort of like taking that very, very old concept of the footprint to suggest walking, to show a walking Buddha. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the only Theravada country in Southeast Asia is the only country where we find a walking Buddha. I think there's a connection there through Theravada tradition to the idea of the Buddha walking. And these are just small examples, but you can see even in these how similar they are to that last figure. They're very fluid, sort of boneless figures. The most famous of them is this piece you see here, which is absolutely stunning. It's almost abstract. I mean, it's almost like it's gone beyond that the human figure. Very graceful, natural. This is bronze from the 14th century. People have compared it to the fluidity of dance, of a dancer. But I just see it sort of dissolving. I would also tie the walking idea to the idea of mendicant monks. So there's perhaps some older connection there to that. Now, we do in Thailand find very, very limited motifs, because it is Theravada. So it's mostly the Shakyamuni, and it's mostly the walking, the sitting, and that's it, and they don't change a lot over time. So those are examples of Sukhothai, and it's really a distinguishable style that's unlike anywhere else. I do want to show you a late work from Thailand from a much later period, from Wat Pho, from Bangkok. Wat means a walled enclosure. This is a monastery, a walled enclosed monastery, and it is the oldest remaining and the largest monastery complex in Thailand. Founded in like the 17th century. This very, very famous reclining Buddha, or sometimes called the Parinirvana Buddha. Parinirvana, he's always shown sleeping, but it really means dead, after his death. This is Shakyamuni after his death, but they never really show him as dead. And he's never called, the dead Buddha. He's always called sleeping Buddha or Parinirvana. This is quite large. It's 150 foot long. It's gold plated, 50-foot high figure. It's impossible to get a good picture of it because of how it's placed. You're always going to see it from what you can see. There's a wall right here in front of it. You can't back up to get a picture. You have to take a picture from the side. And the feet are the most interesting part, where you've got these toes and then all this sort of symbolic carving on the base here. It looks like miniature stupas, perhaps. I haven't seen it. I haven't been there, so I don't know what it is, but beautiful carving. So if you ever get to Southeast Asia, this is one of the things I'm sure you will be taken to see in Bangkok. Indonesia, one of my favorite structures in the whole Buddhist canon is in Indonesia. It's absolutely stunning. Indonesia is made up of a little over 13,000 islands, if you can imagine. I'm sure many of them are tiny and uninhabited, but it was extremely important on the trade route. And it was really formed out of a sort of confederation of islands in this area that connects India to the Philippines and then around to China. It's 3 major islands: Sumatra, Java, and Borneo, with a bit of New Guinea over here. The west side of New Guinea, interestingly, west side of New Guinea is part of Indonesia. The east side is an independent nation, and it's not even part of Asia. This is the border of Asia right here. To the east, that's Melanesia, a different continent entirely. And then all of the islands. We're going to look at an object on the island of Java. Between the 7th century and about 1,000 Buddhist monks and scholars appeared. Java and Sumatra became important Buddhist centers, always Mahayana, however. In fact, there's also a Hindu presence there. There's not much of one now, if any, that I know of. But interestingly, there developed early on a real presence of esoteric Buddhism, and how that happened, I'm not sure. I've never read anyone talking about how, they embraced almost a Tibetan style of esoteric Buddhism in Indonesia. Of course, today it's predominantly Islamic as a nation. The structure we're going to see is right in the geographical center of the island of Java, in a place called Borobudur, right in the center. And this is what we're going to look at, the stupa, the great stupa of Borobudur. Now, all of this was completely lost. It was rediscovered in 1814. First of all, it had completely collapsed. It's on the top of a hill, and the hill itself had caved in. And this whole thing was completely collapsed. It was a pile of nothing but rubble, and it was completely overgrown and invisible. But it was discovered. It was completely cleaned out and rebuilt stone by stone on a new platform. They built a brand new platform, a walled platform to hold it in, and rebuilt the whole thing. What it would have taken to rebuild this, I don't know. This was originally built during this period known as the Great Flowering, which is the Great Flowering of Buddhism is what it meant. It is the largest stupa ever built. And therefore the largest one remaining today. It's absolutely massive. It's 350 feet per side, 98 feet tall, and it's meant to be, there are 9 levels, 9 terraces, and you circumambulate each terrace from the bottom to the top. And if you do so, you will have walked a little over 2 miles. It's a 2-mile route, and it's prepared very carefully. There are 4 square terraces and 3 round terraces, and each of the square terraces, you can kind of see there's a tall wall on the side and sculpture all along the wall. So when you're walking them or when you're circumambulating them, you can't really look out at the land. All you can see is the sculpture along the wall and the sky above you. It's really like closing you in to this sort of chamber that you circulate through. Now, that connection to Tibetan symbolism is really absolutely there. When we looked at the Chorten, the stupa in Tibet, and talked about the symbolism of the, there were 9 levels there. We talked about the geometric versus the curvilinear forms, and how it's really a 3-dimensional mandala. All of these things are true here. It is equally true, as we'll see in just a moment, that it's also a reflection of the Trikaya, or the three body principle in each of the terraces. So you have 9 terraces. The base, which is closer to the earth, symbolizes the Nirmanakaya, or the form body. And remember, that's the relative world, the mundane world that we live in. And that would be images of Shakyamuni. The sculpture at that level then is Shakyamuni as a man and scenes of earthly desire, very much tied to the mundane. The 4 square terraces are associated with the Sambhogakaya, or the bliss body. These are the archetypes of enlightenment, all those bodhisattvas, all those stories, sculptures of Buddha from the sutras, the Jataka tales. And then the 3 round terraces are the Dharmakaya, the truth body, that is the absolute Buddha nature. And we have 72 sculptures of Buddhas in there. We'll look at that in more detail. So as you circumambulate from the ground up, you are symbolically walking this path through the 3 bodies, from the relative to the absolute, and your mind is sort of taken on this journey. Now, this is it as a mandala. Again, we see how it physically sort of pulls up and is elevated into that mandala form. This is what it looks like. It's images like this that make me wonder, like, how did you manage to muster enough, I don't know, power and money and labor to rebuild this thing? What a job this was to put this together. In doing so, they discovered a number of sort of hidden sculptures that are sort of buried behind the walls. I don't even really know much about that, but they absolutely were. So here you can see the 4 square terraces. You can see the tall walls. So and there are stairs on each of the 4 sides. So, you can circumambulate and go up the stairs and then circumambulate again. When you get up to the round levels, what we have are 72 of these miniature stupas, and you can see inside of them, and inside of them is a sculpture of a Buddha, a small sculpture of a Buddha inside, symbolizing the absolute. And then at the very center, at the very top, is the so-called hidden Buddha, which is completely enclosed, and that is the symbol of emptiness, or shunya. Shunyata is emptiness at the very top. So it really has all of that symbolism that we're used to from sort of Tibetan Buddhism, but it's not typical of other of normal, regular Mahayana practices. Cambodia, we're really just going to look at one site. That's all we really need to do. Cambodia is wedged in here between Thailand, Laos, Vietnam. Southeast Asian history is really interesting. If you're ever interested in reading more about it, it's definitely worth it. The earliest kingdom there was founded around 200 CE by an Indian Brahmin, establishing a Hindu sort of outpost in this part of the world. And that also then became a prosperous center that was known as the Funan period, or the Funan kingdom. Interestingly, objects have been found in archaeologists sort of excavating this time frame in Cambodia, have found objects from India, from China, even from Rome. Now, it doesn't mean that Romans were in Cambodia. Things were just brought from Rome, but it does show you how connected the world was, even in a very early period. From early on, they embraced both Hinduism and Buddhism. Different regimes sponsored different things, and there are several really unique forms from Cambodia as well that you don't find anywhere else. And one of them you see right here is the Harihara. The Harihara is a merging of Shiva and Vishnu, and it's going to develop in interesting ways in this part of the world. Harihara figures, you can see how realistic it is in many ways, and this is quite early. I'll show you some others here. So again, you can see what they have in common. The 2 on the left are, well, they're all pretty broken, but you've completely lost the circular form. It's a smooth model body. It's really sort of delicate. And they all had originally an oval sort of enclosed form, almost like a frame that would touch the head and the hands. And and the base. So it's almost like a mandorla. So, you know, what it symbolized, nobody's 100% sure because we just don't have that many of these forms. But this is really what we have from this early period. And it's really quite artistically advanced for being something this early. The king in 750, the king, there was an Indonesian empire that conquered much of this part of Southeast Asia as well. And they were expelled by the Khmer. The Khmer were established around 800, and Khmer eventually, as I mentioned before, will control most of Southeast Asia and were very much around for a very long time. These are the great engineers, and there's no site that demonstrates that greater than, of course, the Angkor site. Angkor is a massive site, as you can see from this image. One of the things that we're going to see appearing in Khmer art, in both Hindu art and architecture and in Buddhist art and architecture, is the idea of the Deva Raja. Now, Deva means God and Raja means king. So a god king is a concept that's uniquely Khmer and Cambodian, doesn't appear anywhere else in Hinduism or Buddhism, anywhere else. The idea that an actual living king is a god. That's really foreign to Asia to a great extent. I mean, even the powerful Chinese emperors who had connections to the gods were the center of the cosmos, didn't claim to be gods. So the Deva Raja concept is somewhat unique to this part of the world. So we're going to see that develop in major forms. So let's look at this massive site. It's 250 square miles, the whole Angkor site. And we're going to look at two different locations there, Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom. We're going to look at both of those. Angkor Wat, the first one we're going to look at is the small one right down here. And it isn't really that small. This is just short of a mile. That's how small that is, and it's the little one. Angkor Thom is the large one here. So we'll look at Angkor Wat first. It's the oldest. It was built by Suryavarman II. And Angkor Wat was not for the public. It was not a place anyone entered other than the king, the priests, and very important people. It was for divine royalty. Here's an aerial view. Now, all of these obviously man-made reservoirs and the like, this is all engineering. This is hydraulic engineering. This is the ability to manipulate water, to move it around. These are incredible skills. There was really no one who had this kind of engineering ability in this time in the world at all. This is really totally unique. It's beautiful, their ability. When you look at the whole site, how all of this is engineered. This is all water engineering. So the site here of Angkor Wat that we're talking about, Wat, as I said before, is a walled complex, and Angkor means city. So Angkor Wat literally means walled city complex, the city that is a walled temple complex. It is the largest temple complex in the world. It's massive. Again, scale is really deceptive. It faces west toward Vishnu. It is a Hindu site and is sacred to Vishnu. I should say it was originally a Hindu site. It was later became a Buddhist site. There are many photographs all over the internet of Buddhist monks walking and circumambulating in Angkor Wat, but that's now, that wasn't then. Massive long causeway and walkway, huge moat. This moat is about 200 yards wide, and so are the massive pavilions that we see here. The here's a satellite view looking down at the complex. You can see how the building structures are concentrically constructed. There's a symbol at work here that identifies this as the center of the cosmos. This is identified as Mount Meru and the 4 continents surrounded by the world river. Now, Mount Meru, the reference to that is ancient. You find it in India. You find it in I'm not sure about China, but definitely in India. You find it in Hindu and Buddhist conceptions. Mount Meru is this mythical mountain that symbolizes the center of the world. And it's always referenced Mount Meru and the 4 continents. It's a phrase that is used to sort of describe the world. So if someone is said to be the king over or the emperor over Mount Meru and the 4 continents, it just means the whole world. I mean, that's sort of what it references, but it's symbolically important in many different ways. There's actually a mudra that symbolizes Mount Meru and the 4 continents. This is it. I don't know if you can see it. That's Mount Meru in the middle and the 4 continents on the side. It's important in Buddhist practices. I don't know about Hindu practices, but it symbolizes an offering and personal dedication is what it symbolizes. It's the most complicated mudra I've ever encountered. I'm amazed my fingers will still bend that way. Actually, kind of surprises me that I can do that. But you have the one tall tower in the middle, Mount Meru, and then the 4 continents. And then this becomes Mount Meru, and this becomes the 4 continents. And then this becomes Mount Meru, and this becomes the 4 continents. And then the great moat around it is the world river. So it reminds me of sort of the geomancy in China, where there's a relationship between structures and water and how it flows. I mean, it's a similar sort of idea. Here is another view where you can see now seeing it from the ground level, you can see that it's built on very high terraces. Each level is on a much higher terrace. It's not really referred to as a pyramid, but there are qualities that are very similar to a stepped pyramid, and it's a very similar idea anyway. It doesn't go quite as far enough to be a pyramid, but the idea of elevation, the most sacred site, the innermost site is the highest and the tallest site. This ground level view is one we've seen a lot. As you can see, for monks and the Devaraja. The water you see here is not the moat. We're a long way from the moat yet. These are just the pools that are in front of it. Many of you may recognize this from Apocalypse Now, when there are scenes of this site in Apocalypse Now where they're bombing, and it's such a beautiful building. The towers themselves you see relationships to Indian structures. They're also actually related to architecture from Burma, which we didn't look at anything from Burma, or should say Myanmar, but I still tend to teach it as Burma. So there are a lot of different influences here. Now, as you approach, the long causeway and crossing the moat, there's a lot of walking here. The bridges are framed by these huge Naga figures. It's relating to water. These are just elegant. These are the most beautiful Nagas that I've ever seen. They're absolutely massive and placed really sort of perfectly. There are a number of different enclosures that you pass through. Nobody really knows what these outer buildings were for. These structures are always known as the libraries. It's what they're called. And nobody has any idea exactly when they started to be called that or why they're called that, because we have no reason to think these were libraries. It's just what they're called. So we don't know. But as you enter through each one, you go through these passages that are filled with sculpture. So outer enclosure, then you go up another terrace. They're fairly sharp vertical climbs, stairs going up to each additional enclosure. Second enclosure, moving into the top, and then this is the inner enclosure. This would be the tallest central tower of Mount Meru, and then these are the four. You can see when I said steep, I meant it. These are very, very tall and very steep towers. So these would be the principal purpose of these would have been this is where the king, the Deva Raja, would commune with the gods. These are not places for religious services necessarily, or even rituals. It's a private world for this king. It's almost impossible not to make certain connections to things like Hindu architecture. The towers you see here, clearly they're connected to mountains. It's called Mount Meru. I mean, you don't have to go very far to recognize the connection to mountains here, as were the Indian temples. The horizontal striations that are like the earth itself, sort of geology of the earth. Here you can see more of the carving in the central tower. Some of the sculpture at Angkor Wat. Sculptural style is really quite different from Indian style. The architecture may be somewhat similar, but the sculpture is very different. It has this body bend, and it's related to dance, as we saw the Indian was, but it's far more angular. The Indian art was fluid. It had its body bends and angularities, but there's a wonderful sort of rhythm in something like this. The apsaras, there are thousands of apsaras in this over this structure. Apsaras sometimes they're called celestial dancers. They're usually female figures, and they're sort of like entertainers for the gods, and is sort of how apsaras are depicted. They're usually in the air, like floating around in the air. This is a Hindu structure, but you see them in Buddhist art as well. So the apsaras are very common. But I love this sort of this repetition, this pattern that's set up, this sort of angular patterning of form and dance. Very Cambodian. Now, the one that's actually in many ways more interesting looking is not in Angkor Wat, but in Angkor Thom, which was an actual city. In many ways. So this is now we're moving from a Hindu site to a Buddhist site. So what happened to Hinduism in Cambodia? And it's still under the Khmer. It's just a different Khmer rulers, but the Khmer are still in power. What happened was there was an invasion. A regime from Vietnam invaded Cambodia and actually did a lot of damage at Angkor, and what happened was they were driven out. They didn't stay there for very long, but it was seen as a failure of the Hindu gods. It's not uncommon historically. The Hindu gods must not have been doing their job. They must not have been doing it right. The Vietnamese, came in and did some damage. So, it tipped the scales over to sort of Buddhism. So let's try these guys for a while because Vishnu wasn't working. So it was a loss of confidence is basically what it was. Undoubtedly, it was more than that. Undoubtedly, there were political reasons, but it became a nice, justification for a slight change within the Khmer rulers. They kept things like the Deva Raja ideal will still be there, etc. So Angkor Thom was built after that, and it is a great walled city. Only this case, it actually is a city. People lived there. Close to 100,000 people actually lived there. At the very center is a temple we're going to look at. That's the Bayon temple right in the center. So it's quite different in its function. Thom actually means great. So Angkor Thom means great city as opposed to the Wat, which was the walled city. So the Bayon actually appears in actually a lot of movies copy it. They may not go there to film, but they steal the design of the temple, and I see them using it a lot. The Bayon temple is dedicated to Lokeshvara, and Lokeshvara is an avatar of Avalokiteshvara. Lokeshvara is a regional version of the Bodhisattva of infinite compassion, the same one who is Kuan Yin, who is Chenrezig in Tibet. It's the same person. In this case, the Deva Raja concept in Cambodia creates a merging between the Khmer king and the Bodhisattva Lokeshvara. It's a unique concept that exists nowhere else in Buddhism. Would a living person be, connected in some way? They might see someone as a reincarnation of that person, which isn't the same thing as sort of being merged by them. Anyway, let's take a look at this temple. It's kind of hard to see. You can kind of see this little face right here? These are called face towers, and they're at all of the gateways and entrances and all around. You can see there are 4 of them here over this gateway, entrance to the Bayon. And these face towers depict this Deva Raja. They are meant to symbolize the ruling king who has merged with Lokeshvara, and they are one. Here are some of the others. I've seen quite a few movies where there'll be some fantasy movie. They just make it up. They don't, to historian, movies can be really frustrating because they'll take something from one part of the world and they'll stick it in another part of the world because some designer thinks it looks good in this movie, but it's really from Africa and they're putting it in China. I mean, it can be very frustrating in movies. So designers will often take these because they're kind of exotic, right, to the Western eye. So they'll take these faces and towers and stick them in. I've seen these used in movies that purport to be from Africa. I see it a lot because you still have that Western sensibility that anything exotic doesn't matter. It's not Western, so let's just lump it all together and throw it in the pot. So I have seen these in many, many movies. So these are our face towers. When we look at how they're built, this is a very classic Khmer style. You see the sort of almond eyes now slightly sort of pulled up. You still see the bow eyebrows. You still see the everted lips. See this little line here, this little edge on the lips. You also see something that will always identify Cambodian architecture, and that is the way they lay blocks. They don't displace the blocks. They're lined up. Normally when you lay blocks or bricks, you offset them, right? So there's not a continuous line of division vertically in the blocks, right? You set them off, but the Cambodians don't. They line up the blocks so that it makes a continuous vertical line. It seems less stable to me. I mean, the reason you offset blocks is you make it more stable. So I don't understand why these things are still standing, but they are. So obviously they know more about it than I do. So this is our aligned blocks. One of my favorite pieces is this, Jayavarman II. He is the one in power at the time Angkor Thom was built. So that's his face merged with the Bodhisattva. In this case, this is even more bizarre, but he's seated as a Buddha, I mean, the idea of a king sort of taking the role of Buddha would almost seem sacrilege if that concept exactly existed. I mean, the concept of sacrilege doesn't really exist per se, but it has that feeling. It's also extremely realistic. It's beautifully natural in its form. It is slightly over life size. He's seated as a meditating Buddha. It's really based on earlier Khmer Buddha Mukhalindas, where you had Shakyamuni seated with, the cobra over his head. That's sort of the influence of this piece. The Khmer will fall to a later Thai dynasty, The Ayutthaya dynasty will fall, Angkor will decline, and it's finally abandoned in the 15th century, the whole Angkor site. Now, most of us are old enough to remember the history of Cambodia in the 20th century. The 30-year war that devastated the country in 1975, the brutal guerrilla army, the Khmer Rouge, basically who claimed the name Khmer from the Cambodian history of the great dynasty Khmer. They basically just took the name of that dynasty and turned it into a sort of communist regime. The persecution of Buddhist monks, the majority of the Buddhist population was massacred. This is sort of the killing fields. This is something that, many of us are, as I said, are old enough to remember when that happened. And that's really all I wanted to look at in Southeast Asia, is just some key monuments. And particularly, I wanted to focus on a few things that were inherently different from anywhere else and that were unique to that part of the world. What I'd like to do now is sort of introduce where we're going to be for a few more classes, and that is in Japan. And I love getting to this point. I'm excited about this. My personal interest is in this area more than any other. My background is more in Japanese art than any other area. And it's just very, very different. And to me, it's more connected to the Western mindset in some ways, as we'll see. Most people, a lot of people anyway, I think the majority, certainly the majority of my students, but that I wasn't saying much because anyway, they would always identify Japan as down here in the Philippines. A lot of people don't realize how far north Japan is. I mean, it's up there with Siberia. I mean, it's literally was connected to Siberia, very, very northern. And it's only the ocean currents that keep it from being frigid. Why does it have such a wonderful climate then, at least for a while? And that is sort of the ocean currents, its location, but it is very, very far north. In fact, it was until relatively recently, as recently as 5,000 years ago, it was still attached to the mainland. It was attached to Korea in the south and Siberia in the north, and what is now the Sea of Japan was, the lake. It was a lake until, quite recently. 5,000 years is not that long. I mean, Alaska was separated longer than that. That was more like 10,000 years ago before it split off from Siberia. Its history is interesting. When we look at that timeline of the nation, I gave you that 2-page timeline. The first 3 Japanese periods, covering the whole first page and a bit of the second page, is all considered prehistory. We basically jump in on page 2. Japan is that young, and we'll see why that is in just a moment. Now, there are people living in this area from very early on, but to a great extent, they are not the people who are predominantly the Japanese today. They are a people that got pushed out of this area a little earlier. Now, of course, it's many, many islands. The major islands are visible here. We're only going to be looking at sites on the island of Honshu, which is the major island, the island of Hokkaido and Kyushu, and Shikoku down here are smaller islands. The people that lived here early are pushed out. They're pushed north and they're pushed south. Many of the people living today in Hokkaido in particular are descendants of the earliest people in Japan. We'll see when that happens, but it hasn't happened as yet in this early period. The earliest period we identify is known as the Jomon period. Jomon simply means rope patterns, and the name is given to the period from ceramic pieces like this. It's stunning piece of ceramics. It's really beautiful. It's one of my favorite. It's clearly a coil built ceramic, but unlike other early coil built, like, I mean, the first ceramics pretty much everywhere are coil built or slab built ceramics. Generally, though, people go out of their way to disguise the coils. They will then smooth the sides or smooth over it in some way so that you don't see the coils. In this case, these people, the Jomon people, which literally just means the people who made these pots, go out of their way to display the nature of the clay and the nature of the method in which the piece is made. And I love that it's sort of undisguised. Undisguised work. You know, you see the character of the clay, you see the character of the making of the pot right there very clearly. The moldability and malleability. We know that at these time, they are in fixed communities, but it wasn't, you know, that long before this, when they were still hunter-gatherers. Now, what I love about this pot is its asymmetry, its energy, its dynamic, like snake-like forms, flame-like forms. And what is painfully obvious is that this couldn't possibly have been a functional pot. I mean, what do you know, how are you going to use this? You can injure yourself attempting to, you know, cook with this. It must have been ceremonial. I mean, that's also suggested by the fact that it exists. You know, the sort of day-to-day cheap pots, they tend to just crack and break and you throw them away. You know, things that people save or intentionally bury or whatever, they're important things. So, you know, its design itself, you know, some people have suggested that it's reminiscent of basketry, which is really interesting because I can see that too, that maybe, you know, it's, you know, intending to look like baskets that were made earlier. So some sort of ceremonial object, stunningly beautiful, but very typical design of these early people, dynamic, energetic, very active. But these people are driven out, and they're driven out during the Yayoi period around 300 BCE, somewhere around that time. Different people moved into Japan through Korea. They're coming down from Korea, moving in, and basically displacing those Jomon people north and south up into the northern islands and the southern islands. The name Yayoi simply comes from one of the early sites or one of the early locations, and it's a decidedly different style in many ways. It's much more subdued, symmetrical, much more of what we would expect to see in China or Korea, actually. And it's these people who are associated with the modern Japanese, definitely. It's also interesting because we see, dating from this period, again, around the 3rd century BCE, the introduction of bronze and iron at the same time. Now, this is interesting because that doesn't happen everywhere in the world. Bronze is developed first. After learning bronze metallurgy, the first metallurgy, then people move on and learn to work with iron. That is the natural human progression of metallurgy. The fact that both appeared at the same time tells us very clearly that it was brought to Japan by the people who entered in that 3rd century, that they didn't develop naturally, that the Jomon people, since we have no bronze from them, clearly they didn't have bronze, or that's not necessarily a true assumption. Just because you don't have something doesn't mean it isn't there. But finding them both appearing at the same time tells us it's not a natural development of the region, but was brought in. Now, this is a bell, and it should ring a bell, pardon my pun, but it should remind us of the Chinese bell that we saw dating from much, much earlier. It is similar in many ways. It is sort of an elliptical form. Its designs are very different, however, and functioned very differently. These seem to have been ritual bells known as a dotaku, which basically just means a ritual bronze bell. It's about 19 inches tall. It seems to have been owned by a village. The Chinese bells we found in tombs, and they were ones made for a funeral service, probably played for that ceremony and then placed in the tomb. These, however, were used regularly. They seem to have been owned as by a village, used at various rituals and ceremonies, rung. Maybe they called deities. Maybe they were associated with sort of agricultural ceremonies or fertility, maybe general well-being. Nobody knows, but they were kept and used regularly. And then the ones we find were buried on hilltops. So whether that means it's not being used anymore, so let's bury it on the hilltops, but not a person's burial. I mean, it's just the bell is buried. So it's a very, very different function that we've seen before. Now, early on, the bells, they developed a unique casting system where instead of using clay forms to cast the bronze in the techniques that were used in other parts of the world, they used stone casts, which meant that you could reuse them. Because the problem with these ceramic cast is you have to break it, it's a one of a kind. But if you use stone cast, then you can make many, many identical bells, which is like kind of a brilliant idea. But they stopped doing that after a while and decided uniqueness was more important. And then they started using clay and then started making unique bells. So if you want all to be identical, then you'll use a stone cast. If you want them to be unique, then you will use a clay cast. The pattern here is sometimes referred to as the flowing water pattern, but there are sort of geometric designs. In my mind, this is not yet really what I would call a Japanese style. It's not fully developed. This is more what I see as Chinese or Korean, and that's who these people largely were. So they're going to develop their own style, and it won't really be exactly like this. One of my favorite objects comes out of this site. This is a tomb of Emperor Nintoku, as it is known. It says near Osaka. Clearly, it's right in the middle of a city at present. I'm sure it wasn't originally. And it lends its name to this period, the Kofun period, and these are all still considered sort of pre-history, in the sense that they have no writing at this time. So it's pre-written history. Kofun means large mounded tomb, and it's what we have from this period. So that's why we call it that, the period of the large mounded tombs. These are also referred to as keyhole tombs, which is interesting because it does kind of look like a keyhole. You could also argue it looks like a bell, and that makes a lot more sense than a keyhole, but not really sure. That is a moat around it, this forest, and then that solid green is a moat. So it's an imperial tomb. It's obviously quite important. It also, when you have something on this scale, this kind of building activity, it speaks to a level of organization and power in order to be able, again, to sort of, muster the required manpower to complete something like this. We're not going to really look inside, and inside it's basically just stone-lined chambers that were painted, and they had some bronze ornamentation. It held ceremonial materials and objects. The ceremonial forms of Japan that we're going to see over and over again are certainly some aspects of jade, but particularly mirrors and swords. Mirrors and swords become the symbol of the imperial family, and we're going to see them appearing in other places. Mirror is the sun symbol associated with the sun goddess. We'll talk about her, and we're believed to have sort of magical power. But what I want to look at, that's the most interesting part of this tomb, are these objects that were found on the tomb and all around the tomb, and that is about 20,000 of these figures known as Haniwa figures. the haniwa, literal hani means clay, and wa simply means circle or cylinder. So that's their haniwa. And they're well, we'll look at several examples of different haniwa. They're typically around 25 to 30 inches tall. They're hollow, clay earthenware. They're very crude, unfinished, unglazed, unpolished. They're very rough. They always remind me of what I would see, the first objects that came out of the ceramic student lab. Every semester in the first class, you basically made something that looked like a haniwa. It's like your first attempt. That's what they look like. But clearly, this is an imperial tomb. So these were not like the freshman's first attempt. They look this way because they're meant to look this way, not because they don't have skill. They're earthenware, meaning low fired, very sort of common. They're also very undisguised in what they are. They're very much obvious clay. They show the manipulation and movement of clay. They emphasize the properties of clay, which were all part of it. Now, what kinds of objects are there? Well, first of all, let me show you where they're placed. They're placed all the way around in concentric circles, all the way around the tomb itself at various sort of levels. At the lower level, there would be like a line of them all the way around the tomb. And then at a higher level, all the way around. And then there were a few at the top. We'll talk in a minute about why they are, what they are. But in terms of the forms themselves, it could be anything. People, these are strange little ghostly like figures. There are houses. It seemed to be, some of them are soldiers, some of them are weapons. There are people in all sorts of occupations, falconers like that first one, some are farmers. There are musicians, dancers. It seems to be like it's a little bit of everything. It's life. So is it like a community, and buildings and houses? And there's always a house right at the spot that's directly over the emperor's tomb. There's a house, which has got to be significant. So is this like the house of the emperor, and this is the community around the figure, around them? So some people have suggested, so what are they? Are they guardian figures like our clay figures of Emperor Qin Huang? It's, his are all soldiers. The Japanese are not. There are soldiers in there, but that's just one more occupation, like all the other occupations. The Chinese figures are life-size. They're laid out in regimented order like an army. They're clearly guardians. The Japanese is less obvious whether they're, let's leave that on, whether they're guardians or not. We don't know that. They're clearly perhaps a separation. Some people have suggested, many people think, that they're there to act and symbolize the separation between the worlds of the living and the worlds of the dead, that there's somehow a demarcation, like a place, marking a place for his spirit to be, perhaps something like that. I think that's more likely than guardians. There is no, often figures like the Chinese army are replacements for ancient human sacrifice. In much of the world, when you go back far enough, you're going to find human sacrifice took place very early on. People were buried with kings and rulers. However, there is no evidence at all that this ever took place in Japan. There is clear evidence that it did take place in China, I mean, in many other places, clearly in Egypt, but no evidence that ever happened. So, and these haniwa don't have that feeling. They don't have that feeling of guardians or a sacrifice. So what they are is unclear. This is an interesting one, this sort of seated female shaman-like figure, because it is so simple and so seemingly crude, but all of these haniwa are considered to be the earliest examples we have of what we're going to see over and over again as the sort of core of Japanese aesthetic, and not the only aesthetics, but two of the most prominent, and that's wabi and sabi. Wabi meaning they are very humble, they're very simple, they're very minimal. As an aesthetic, that will pervade Japanese art throughout its history. Sabi is this reference to the rustic, the worn, the aged, something that is old, this sort of respect for something that is aged and old. And I would add to that, related to both of these, is a kind of truth to the materials, a sort of earthiness to them, a beauty in the imperfect, which is certainly part of Sabi, because generally if something is rustic and worn and old, it's imperfect in some ways. So all of those characteristics are clearly here. I love these pieces. If you travel to Japan, you're going to come home with little miniature. It's a typical sort of tourist thing, is a little miniature version of a haniwa. And actually, I think we're going to look at the very end, we're going to look at some contemporary Japanese art. And there's a well-known Japanese contemporary piece that uses haniwa, as a kind of symbol. Okay, Shinto. Let's talk briefly about Shinto. And I sent the handout, you have them. Again, I don't want to go through the whole thing. Shinto is really fairly simple as an idea as compared to some other religions. We call it that today, but it certainly wasn't conceived of as that until Buddhism arrived. It didn't even have a name. Certainly wasn't thought of as a religion. It was just simply the way things were. You didn't think of it any other way. It means way of the kami or spirits. Sometimes it's translated as gods. I prefer to think of them as spirits more than gods. It's a little different concept, generally associated with nature, not recognized as a religion, practiced primarily through festivals and rituals. Key concepts, it's largely positive. It's really a kind of celebration of life. Few of the kami are what you would call evil. They're mostly, the ones that cause trouble are mostly more like little tricksters or whatever, and they often learn their lesson. It's not like there are evil demons or anything like that. Respect for nature, again, the belief system itself is so rooted in humility and simplicity. You can see why the aesthetic is going to affect what they create. The primary kami, and as far as I know, and I cannot think of another one, this is the only female form associated with the sun. Everywhere else in the world, the sun is male. The sun is a god. It's always a male god associated with the sun. This is female goddess Amaterasu.
Scandinavia.
Oh, in Scandinavia?
Yeah,
interesting.
the goddess Freya.
Oh, I didn't realize. I'd heard the name, but I don't know that much about the myth. I didn't realize she was a sun goddess.
Yeah,
okay,
her chariot is pulled by cats.
Oh, I love it.
She becomes Santa Lucia when she gets Christianized.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, Light. Yeah, Saint Light.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to look her up. But the sun goddess Amaterasu, or sometimes she's identified as Amaterasu no Omikami, which a no in the name, and O is an honorific. And it identifies her as the primary kami. Her children are all the other kami, and they give birth to the imperial family. That's another important tie here. All emperors of Japan have been considered kami or related to the gods until the current. I mean, he was. I guess I don't know that much about the current emperor in Japan, how old he is. If he was born after World War II, then he was never considered a god. And that's probably the case. I guess there's not that many people living today. I lose track of time. Kami are not omnipotent beings. Their role is to sustain and protect. Now, when Buddhism arrived, things began changing. Before Buddhism, there were no temples, there were no shrines, nothing physical. What they might do is certain spaces or places, generally out in the woods, would be identified or recognized as having a strong presence of the kami or spirits. You know, maybe there's this space by this little waterfall and these rocks, and you just feel when you're there that the spirits are there. So what you might do is you might put up some string around it and sort of hang little bits of fabric that blow in the wind, or maybe you pile some stones up to identify the spot. That's as close as you got to having a shrine. But after Buddhism arrived, they started literally building shrines. Literally, it becomes, it gets a name. It's now a recognized religion. There are now Shinto priests. There are now built Shinto shrines. And I want to take a look at the most famous of the sites, the most sacred of the sites, and that is at Ise, not too far from Nara in Japan, located right down here along the coast. As you can see, there is it's identified as the wedded rocks. We're going to look at that right at that spot. And then there are paths where you walk up to the shrine. It's known as the Jingu Shrine. Is the whole complex is called the Jingu Shrine, and you've got the inner shrine and the outer shrine, the Geku and the Naiku. We're going to look at the Naiku of the inner shrine, and some of the sort of pathway that gets you up to that location. So together, it's the grand shrine. These are the wedded rocks, and they are immediately off the coast. Oops, let me back that up. I'm trying to move my pictures of you. Hold on. Well, I don't seem to be able to do that. Anyway, the wedded rocks. These are two natural rocks, and they symbolize the founding, the sort of primeval couple, Izanagi and Izanami, male and the female. I've always found this image to be really, really difficult to get a sense of scale from, because you've got a little gateway up here, but it's not a full-size gateway. This tall stone, Izanagi, is 30 foot tall. And the shorter stone, the female figure, Izanami, is 12 feet tall. So that's a sense of scale. This long rope that connects them is the sacred rope. It's made out of rice straw. It has to be changed actually several times a year because it's just exposed to the elements. It doesn't last very long. And there's a gateway up here at the top. So they symbolize the primal couple who gave birth to the Japanese islands. So this is part of a creation story as well. Again, it's a major tourist site and everyone comes to this site. As you make your way up to the shrines, as you can see, the shrines are located here. This is the outer shrine located over there. I want to take a look at the pathway to get up there because that's part of the process. You know, whenever you're, there's a lot of places that are designed so that you have to walk a certain path or travel a certain route. And part of that is the process of sort of shifting your mind from one reality to another reality, that idea of passageway. One of the things you do is stop at the river. This is part of purification, ritual, which is always important, washing your hands, etc. This is an example of an wakura, which is a sacred stones. It's very similar to what would have happened before you built shrines. It's like some rocks, you put some stones down, you put some string around it. So it's just sort of marking a sacred site. And then you pass through one of many torii, entrances to sacred spaces. These are sacred gateways And I'm still trying to move my images of you to get you out of my, there we go. I finally figured it out. Good. Okay. Now,
Peggy?
the Tori Japanese design, we'll see that again, very reminiscent of the Toranas that we saw in Indian architecture. Again, we saw it around the stupas. It's a ceremonial gateway you walk through. It symbolizes that transition from a sort of mundane to a sacred space. You know, it's not unlike the adorned doorways you see in a Gothic cathedral. It's the same thing. It's a symbol of passage from
So,
the outside to
Peggy,
the inside. Yes.
are we saying they were not putting the Torii before Buddhism came?
Correct, because they weren't building sacred
Okay,
sites.
interesting. Thanks.
You're welcome. Now, let me clarify that, whether this design is rooted in something else earlier, I don't know. They weren't related to Shinto shrines before that, but they could be basing this on some sort of common, something in culture, because they often do that. The early Shinto shrines are based on buildings that were used sort of by peasants for storage buildings, for example. So
That
the
makes
form
sense, yeah.
may come from somewhere else. That I don't know. And then there's wonderful walk through the pine forest to the Jingu shrines. I love these sacred pine forests. I love how they wrap them to protect them from the people, no doubt, so that people would want to touch them so they don't damage the trees. But it is a beautiful design. I have to say, my professor that I took the Japanese art class with was Japanese, and he often told us stories about his childhood in Japan. And apparently, once a year, the school children, this would be your field trip, is you'd get bused down to the Jingo Shrine and go up. And it reminded us of like where our field trips were, because I'm from Illinois. So our field trips, you'd get bused down to Springfield and you would, visit Lincoln's home and all of that sort of stuff. Well, in Japan, the school children are bused out to Issei and they get to walk the path. So he remembered a lot of those activities. It was fun hearing stories from someone who grew up in Japan. This is the most famous building, the one that's always photographed, the main building in the inner shrine. And so this is in the east, this is the Naiku, the inner shrine, which is dedicated to Amaterasu no Omikami, which means heaven illuminating great spirit, her full name, the sun goddess, and ancestor to the imperial family. And that becomes more important as time goes on. The outer shrine, the other one in the west, the Geku, is dedicated to a kami who is associated with agriculture, grain, and abundance. The building itself is quite different from anything in China. It's a purely Japanese designed building, elevated wood, thatched roof, and we'll talk more about that later. There's a fence around it. We'll look at some other views in a minute, but this inner area is not entered by people. This is only for the Shinto priests. If you're a tourist and you go up there, you're not going to walk in to the actual shrine. It's not going to happen. Here's a view that shows sort of two side-by-side sites. The main sanctuary that's being used. So this is the main building that we just saw. And then there would be two smaller storage buildings behind it called the treasure house. These are storage buildings where rice might be kept for the ceremonies or rituals, where objects used in rituals or ceremonies might be kept. And here's an aerial view that shows the inner shrine. So why are there two of them? And they don't look the same, right? One is sort of dark and worn. The other one looks kind of brand new. because it is. There are two sites side by side, and every 20 years the site is rebuilt, and everything is moved over to the new buildings, and the old one is torn down, and then it will be rebuilt in 20 years. So why does it need to be rebuilt every 20 years? That's because it is built out of wood, and that wood is unpainted and unprimed, exposed to the elements. The longest wood can hold up is 20 years. So every 20 years since it was first built, it was rebuilt. And the last time was 2013. So we've got a while before it is rebuilt again. When the wood is cut for these buildings, and since, you know, nature is sacred and trees are sacred, it's a sacred act to cut down these trees. And they're very careful when they cut it down and make the boards of the wood, that they mark what tree it comes from, so that when a building is built, all of the wood from one tree is kept together, to sort of keep the essence of that tree together. You don't want like one board over in that building and a board from the same tree over in that building. That wouldn't be respecting the tree. So they're marked very carefully that way. This is one of the smaller buildings. Now, this style is based on the granary. They're based on peasant granary buildings, the simplest, the most humble building structure. These extensions that you see sticking up here, now, originally, those functioned to cover the thatching and sort of help hold the thatching down. But over time, they became symbols of the imperial family, and they're actually very similar. They're called chigi, and you can see them here. They become symbols of the imperial family, but you see them on the extensions on samurai armor. We're going to look at samurai armor later, and you're going to see forms like that at the top. So they're symbolic of various things. Now, as a tourist, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see the outer wall and the buildings. You're not going to go inside those buildings and see anything else. I've often been asked what happens to the wood when when a building is taken apart. I mean, logic tells me they would be treated respectfully in some way. And I've tried to find out, and I can't find anybody saying what happens to it. I'm sure it's out there to find somewhere, but I haven't been able to find out exactly what happens when that's taken down. I suspect it's either buried together or perhaps burned, like a cremation or something, but I'm sure it's not just thrown on the dump. That wouldn't make any sense. We're ready to start talking about the arrival of Buddhism into Japan and Buddhist art. Let me just leave you with a general sort of comment about it. When we looked at China, so much of everything we saw in China was rooted in the imperial system and this idea of an all-powerful emperor at the center of the cosmos ruling. The emperor and the imperial system in Japan is very, very different as a political system. Rarely, if ever, was the Japanese emperor in political control of much of anything. There are always exceptions, but it has an imperial system, but it's nothing like the Chinese imperial system. The development of Japanese culture and Japanese art is rooted much more in the long tradition of the clan system and the power of the clan system and what becomes warrior clans in Japan, who will learn how to connect themselves to the imperial system in interesting ways, and will learn how to claim power through the emperor. So the emperor is more of a figurehead through whom warrior lords will learn to rule. And that's going to lead to a very different underlying sensibility in architecture and art in general, the different sort of voice that the culture speaks through. I will see you next week when we continue.